When it comes to hand sanding, most woodworkers use a 9x11 piece of sandpaper like I've got right here. Now if you're like me, the way I would use this in my shop for hand sanding, I'd take that 9x11 sheet piece of paper, I'd cut it down into smaller strips, I'd try to find me a flat piece of scrap material and wrap that piece of paper around it and try to do my hand sanding. The problem with this method is that it's very difficult to keep the paper tight and flat. The sanding paper also has a tendency to tear on the corners, and I really don't get a chance to use the entire surface because I only really have a small area that I can work with. The rest of the paper is used to grip the block. So some of us have gone out and purchased the aftermarket sanding blocks like I've got here. Now, these aren't really much better. They're very difficult to load the paper up underneath those little nails, and it's incredibly hard to get it tight enough that the paper doesn't move back and forth and eventually tear on that line. So let me show you a brand new tool called the Sand Devil, which is a much better solution. It's made from thermoplastic, very long life, it's got a lifetime warranty on it, but what I really like about this tool is that it doesn't use the 9x11 sheets. We're using a standard 3x21 sanding belt. It's just like loading an electric belt sander. We pull back on the tension device, which releases the back assembly, and the belt slides off. If you want to change grits from a coarse to a medium to a fine, it only takes a second. Slide it back on and push the tension device down, and if you listen, hear how it snaps that belt real tight? I've got a perfectly flat, tight surface. Now, it also has a pointed area, a tapered. We can use both the top and the bottom. We've got a curved area and a square corner to get into those really tight areas. Now, one of the best features about this is the cloth sanding belt. The cloth sanding belt typically will outlast the standard 9x11 sheet 10-to-1. And when we drag it across a very sharp edge, it doesn't tear the paper. Even if I take it down on this sharp corner, I can really use it like a rasp without worrying about tearing the surface, and you can see how quickly we remove the stock. Now let me show you a few other tips on how to use your Sand Devil in your shop. Sanding out defects in flat stock with the Sand Devil. Most of us already own random orbit sanders. The problem with trying to get a defect out of flat stock with a random orbit sander is that the soft pad on the underside follows the contours of the stock. That's what makes the Sand Devil a handy tool. The large flat surface will bridge over that defect and allow us to work out the stock nice and evenly. Now I know it's difficult to see, but the board I have in front of me has got a mark right across it here from the planer. I'm going to highlight this with a pencil. I'm using about a 150 grit sandpaper on my Sand Devil. Now, because we've got a nice long flat surface, the Sand Devil is also very aggressive. It only takes a couple strokes to work out that defect in our stock. Bridging across that area and working it down nice and uniform. You can see that all that is gone and the mark is taken out because we're bridging across it. Now, this is also handy if you do any sort of framework like a raised panel door and the area is very small like you see right here. If I took my random orbit sander and try to use it here, it rolls over those edges and I lose the crisp edge of this frame. Again, the Sand Devil can be placed on top and it allows me to work out those two uneven surfaces to get a nice flat surface all the way across my frame. Now let me show you a couple other ways on how you can use your Sand Devil. Sanding tight corners and curved surfaces with the Sand Devil. I've got a little mini raised panel door here in front of me, and one of the challenging things to hand sand is these tight corners on the inside of our panel. Now typically we would try to take a piece of sandpaper and fold that sandpaper up into a really tight edge in order to get in there and try to sand it. What I like to do is I use my Sand Devil for those tight corners. Let me go ahead and take the door apart here and show you how we use the tool. Now, what I like to do here, because we're using a cloth sanding belt, which is a lot more rigid than your typical 9x11 sheet, I'm going to release the tension here, and I'm going to slide that sanding belt so that the edge of the belt sticks out past the Sand Devil by about 1/8 of an inch, and lock it back in place. Now by doing that, I end up with a super crisp edge, a tighter edge than you can even get by folding up sandpaper. We take that piece that we're trying to sand and it fits right into that corner. So even if we had a little defect or a burn mark that was left behind by that router, we could take our Sand Devil, get into that tight corner, and essentially remove it in the matter of seconds without losing the profile. Now when it comes down to large curved areas, and one of the things I hate sanding the most is the curves on the raised panels. Most of us typically lose that sharp edge because we end up hitting it with an electric sander. We can use the same technique with our Sand Devil. The only difference is we're going to release the tension of our Sand Devil. We're now going to slide that sanding belt out about 1/2 of an inch and lock it back into place. Now, even though the sanding belt isn't on the entire surface of the Sand Devil, it's not going to rotate around because of that locking device. And now the sandpaper is rigid, but yet has enough give to follow the contours. So when it comes down to getting into those profiles, I can sand that entire shape and detail that, especially across down on the end here to get any burn marks out, and then come back and tune it up with a finer grit sandpaper using my Sand Devil. Sanding molding, trim, and tight corners with the Sand Devil. One of the hardest things to get out of your molding and trim is burn marks. Because we've got multiple surfaces to work with our Sand Devil, we could turn our Sand Devil up on edge, which will allow you to get into those tight areas without tearing the sandpaper. Again, we're using that cloth sanding belt, which is very durable and doesn't rip like a normal sanding sheet. When it comes down to these really tight corners in this piece of trim, we can use the Sand Devil just like we did on that panel. We release the tensioning device here, slide our belt over. If we want a real crisp corner, we're going to leave about 1/8. If you want more flexibility, leave about 1/4 of an inch and lock it back into place. As you can see, even though we're not fully on the Sand Devil, the belt doesn't rotate around. Getting down into that tight corner to remove that stubborn burn mark now becomes a very simple task to sand it out. Now when it comes to sanding inside corners, like I've got right here, that's also a challenge to get the sandpaper right up against that surface. Most of us would take a piece of sanding sheet, fold it, and try to get that crisp corner and get down in there to sand out that little piece of glue or stubborn mark left behind. The problem with sanding sheets is as soon as you crease them, that creates an area for this to tear rather quickly. The Sand Devil uses a sanding belt, which is a very durable material. To get into that corner nice and tight, what we're going to do is we're going to position the belt and we're going to let it hang out over that edge about 1/64 of an inch. That gives us a very crisp corner to work with here. What that allows us to do when we turn that into that corner, I can actually sand either the side surface nice and tight against the edge or position in its lower position to get the lower surface as well. Now as you can see, with all the sanding that we've been doing by knocking off the edges and the sharp corners, our sanding belt is still as good as new, but you notice how it's starting to load up a little bit. Now most of you don't think about using this application with a hand tool, but because we're using a durable sanding belt, unlike a piece of sandpaper, we can actually take our belt cleaning stick and now basically rub that across that sanding belt, and we end up cleaning off any material that is left behind, making our sanding belts last even longer.